According to ongoing investigation, it has been alleged that the parents of a 4-year-old girl used corrosive chemicals and other tools to dissolve the remains of their child and poured into a Southern Carolina lake, Aiken County. It has been the most devastating news for the people of the Aiken community. And on July 9, 2026, in front of a wall of cameras, Sheriff Marty Sawyer said, "In my 37 years in law enforcement," his voice catching on the words, "I have never, ever heard of anything so horrific." He is not talking about a mass shooting. He is not talking about a serial killer stalking a highway. He is talking about a 4-year-old girl named Javeayah Harris, and about what her own parents allegedly did to her body after she was already gone. Chemicals, corrosive chemicals, investigators say, used over days to break down what remained of a little girl. And when the chemicals weren't enough on their own, what was left, according to warrants, was carried out of that home, driven across county lines, and dropped into a reservoir so remote and so choked with dead trees that locals don't even call it by its real name, Cedar Creek Reservoir, on the map, Stumpy Pond, to everyone who's ever tried to fish it, or search it, or make sense of what's hidden beneath its surface. Sawyer said he was truly sickened by what the investigation has uncovered and called the parents' actions repulsive and revolting. More than 200 first responders, sheriff's deputies, FBI agents, state troopers, volunteer firefighters, converged on a quiet residential pocket of Aiken, South Carolina, while her father stood in front of a local news camera and told a reporter his daughter didn't run away, that she was friendly to a fault, that she said yes ma'am, no ma'am, to every stranger she met, while her mother sat inside a 911 call, 39 weeks pregnant, describing pink Minnie Mouse pajamas and a backyard chicken coop where her daughter liked to play hide and seek from the world. Somewhere in that search radius, investigators would later say, Javeayah had been dead for approximately 1 month before she was first reported missing on June 30th in Aiken County. Let that detail sit for a second, because it's the hinge this entire case turns on. 200 people searched, a community organized, a local restaurant owner cooked and delivered 60 free meals, so exhausted search crews could keep going. Digital billboards flashed a missing girl's photo to every car passing a gas station on Escaga Lake Road. And according to the very people who reported her missing, none of it could have ever brought her home, because home, by then, was no longer a word that applied to Javeayah Harris. This is the story of a case that started as a missing child alert and ended with a sheriff refusing, on camera, in front of his own department, to call 2 people, mom and dad. It's the story of a 911 call built, according to investigators, on a lie specific enough to send a state searching in the wrong direction for days. It's the story of a confession that came faster than anyone expected, of search boats launched into a body of water most people in South Carolina had never heard of, and of a forensic detail so grim that a 37-year veteran sheriff said, unprompted, that it was the worst thing he'd ever encountered in his career. It's also a story that asks something uncomfortable of anyone watching it unfold, hearing it laid out from beginning to end. It asks you to hold 2 truths at once, that a community's compassion, the free meals, the volunteer searchers, the digital billboards, was completely genuine, and that it was, according to investigators, also completely misdirected, spent in service of a story that never had any chance of ending the way everyone hoped. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. It's also, in a strange way, exactly why this case deserves to be told carefully rather than sensationally. Because somewhere underneath the shock value of chemicals and reservoirs is a much simpler, much sadder question. What does a community do with grief for a child it never got the chance to actually protect? But before we get to the warrants, the chemicals, the reservoir, you need to know who Javeayah Harris actually was. You need to watch till the end so you don't miss crucial details in this case. This is Cold Crime Chronicles, where we uncover cold cases. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you follow cold cases like this. Javeayah Harris was 4 years old, 3 feet 6 inches tall, 42 pounds, small enough, still, that most of her clothes probably came from the toddler aisle, rather than the kids section. She wore her hair in braids, threaded through with pink beads, and pink, by every account given after her disappearance, was her favorite color. It's a small detail, but it mattered enough to the people investigating her death that Sheriff Sawyer asked his own staff to wear pink ribbons and pink ties to a press conference in her honor. Dozens of grown adults in uniform, standing behind him, quietly wearing her favorite color, while he delivered some of the worst news his department had ever had to share, by her father's own description, given to a local news crew in the days before his arrest, when he still believed he was the parent of a missing child rather than a suspect in her death. Javeayah was an unusually open kid, not fearful, not guarded. She's friendly, Javeayah Harris told a news reporter. She was just all friendly to everybody. She was very respectful. Yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes sir, no sir. That's what she does. We raised her great. She was a really smart kid. Javeayah's mother, Javeayah Harris, described her daughter in strikingly similar terms during the 911 call that would later become one of the most chilling pieces of audio in the entire case. Smart, talkative, able to carry a full conversation. In Harris's words to dispatchers, Javeayah lived with her parents in a home near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road in Aiken, a quiet working-class residential stretch in a mid-sized South Carolina city about 20 miles from the Georgia state line. The family kept chickens in the backyard, and by multiple accounts, the coop was Javeayah's favorite spot to play. It was the first place her mother said she checked when Javeayah supposedly went missing from the yard. It's a detail that, in an honest missing child case, would be an obvious, natural clue. The place a child likes to hide, the place searchers check first. In this case, it became something closer to set dressing. A believable detail folded into a story investigators now allege was constructed almost entirely from believable details, one on top of another, until it sounded exactly like the kind of tragedy that happens every single day. Neighbors at a previous family address on Harris Street in Union County would later tell reporters they barely noticed the family at all. Quiet, private, the kind of household that gives you nothing to work with from the outside until the worst has already happened. No PTA meetings, no neighborhood barbecues, no pattern of visible red flags that anyone outside the home was positioned to catch. By the time most of South Carolina learned her name, Javeayah Harris had already been gone, in the most permanent sense, for the better part of a month. Tuesday, June 30th, 2026, just before 9 p.m., as the summer heat finally started to break on a South Carolina evening, a woman's voice comes through to Aiken County 911 dispatch. Breathless, urgent, exactly the voice you'd expect from a parent in crisis. Emergency, 39 Hillsborough Street. I can't find my baby. The dispatcher asks for details. Working through the standard script every 911 operator learns to run through almost on instinct. The caller identifies herself as Javeayah. She spells out her daughter's name letter by letter for the dispatcher, because it's not a name the dispatcher recognizes or can easily catch by ear. She explains that her daughter had been playing outside in the backyard while she finished cooking dinner, and that when she stepped back outside to check on her, Javeayah was simply gone. She describes what her daughter is wearing, in the kind of granular detail that, again, sounds exactly like what a frantic parent would offer. Pink Minnie Mouse pajamas. Braided hair, threaded with pink beads. She mentions she's 39 weeks pregnant, that her body physically can't move the way it normally would to chase down a fast 4-year-old. She tells the dispatcher about the chicken coop in the backyard, the place Javeayah likes best, the place she'd normally check first. When the dispatcher asks whether Javeayah has any health conditions dispatchers should be aware of, Harris mentions autism, adding immediately that there's never been a formal diagnosis. It's a strange thing to volunteer in a moment of supposed panic, the kind of careful, qualifying detail that a person under genuine acute stress doesn't always think to include. But dispatchers log it exactly as given and move the response forward. Within minutes, Aiken County Sheriff's deputies are en route to Hillsborough Street, and a missing child search that will eventually span 4 counties and 200 first responders has officially begun. What follows over the next several days is one of the largest search operations Aiken County has mounted in recent memory. By the following morning, July 1st, the search had already expanded far past a single suburban backyard. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, joined. The State Highway Patrol joined. Volunteer fire departments across the county mobilized their crews. A helicopter thundered overhead, methodically working grid patterns over the wooded areas surrounding Hillsborough and Ridgecrest. Drones scanned the tree canopy from angles ground crews couldn't reach. Cadaver dogs and tracking dogs worked the underbrush, their handlers pushing through dense summer growth in conditions that would have been brutal, even without the added pressure of a ticking clock. By some estimates, more than 200 first responders were involved at the search's peak, an extraordinary mobilization for a single missing child in a county of Aiken's size. The search itself grew in concentric rings outward from the Harris Herring home, the way most missing child searches do in their early days. First, the immediate yard and the chicken coop Herring had specifically flagged as Javeayah's favorite spot. Then the wooded lot directly behind the property. Then the wider residential blocks surrounding Hillsborough and Ridgecrest. Door to door, deputies asking neighbors whether they'd seen a small girl in pink pajamas at any point that evening or since. Then drainage ditches, culverts, and the kind of overgrown lots that dot the edges of any mid-sized southern neighborhood. The places search coordinators know, from grim experience, that a wandering child is statistically most likely to be found, alive or otherwise. By day 2, the search radius had expanded to include nearby ponds and creek systems, on the theory, however painful, that a small child playing unsupervised near water poses its own tragic risk, independent of any abduction scenario. None of those expanding search rings, of course, ever had any chance of finding what investigators were actually unknowingly looking for. Javeayah wasn't in the chicken coop. She wasn't in the wooded lot. She wasn't in any creek or drainage ditch within miles of Hillsborough Street. According to everything that would later be alleged in the warrants, she had never been there to begin with. Not on June 30th, not wandering off that evening, not anywhere within that entire search radius at any point during the days law enforcement spent combing through it. The search was, in the most literal and devastating sense, looking in the only place she couldn't possibly be. By Thursday, July 2nd, 3 full days into the search, cracks had already begun to show. Not in the investigation itself, but in public confidence in how it was being run. Members of the Aiken community began publicly asking a pointed question. Why hadn't an Amber Alert been issued for a missing 4-year-old girl? It's a fair question on its face, and one that echoes across plenty of missing child cases where alert criteria feel, to grieving or anxious communities, frustratingly bureaucratic. The sheriff's office responded carefully, explaining that the situation as reported didn't meet the technical criteria required to trigger the alert system, and adding a line that, read back now with the benefit of hindsight, feels almost like foreshadowing. We simply cannot risk someone not properly trained making a mistake, missing a clue, or causing other harm. By Friday, July 3rd, 4 exhausting days into a search that had covered thousands of acres in dangerous heat, with no trace of Javeayah found, the sheriff's office made the difficult, and to the public, disheartening call to scale back visible search efforts. To anyone following the case from the outside, it looked like exactly the kind of story that quietly goes cold, hope fading, resources thinning, a missing child slipping toward the grim category of cases that never get solved. Saturday, July 4th, 2026, Independence Day. While most of South Carolina spent the evening watching fireworks, Aiken County Sheriff's investigators were doing something far less celebratory, taking Javeayah Harris and Michelle Herring into custody. The announcement, when it came, was fast and blunt, the kind of statement that instantly recontextualizes every headline that came before it. Sheriff Marty Sawyer stood in front of the same cameras that had, days earlier, broadcast a father's tearful plea for help finding his daughter, and delivered the words that would define this entire case going forward. Today, I am announcing that we have arrested Javeayah's parents. We have arrested her dad, 23-year-old Javeayah Harris, for homicide by child abuse, and her mom, 22-year-old Michelle Herring, for homicide by child abuse and filing a false police report. There it was. Not a stranger who'd snatched a child from a backyard. Not an abduction by someone unknown to the family. According to authorities, investigators had come to believe that the very 2 people who stood in front of cameras pleading for the public's help, the ones whose faces had been on the news, whose voices had been on the 911 recording, whose grief had organized a 200-person search, were themselves responsible for Javeayah's disappearance, and very likely her death. Sawyer didn't soften the blow for the public either, in the statement that followed. Sadly, he said, it was already too late to save her the moment the 911 call came in on June 30th. According to the sheriff's office, evidence at that point already indicated Javeayah had been dead for at least a month, meaning the entire search, from its very first hour, had been for a child who could never actually be found alive. Read that again, because it's worth sitting with. A month. Which means that while a helicopter thundered over Aiken County day after day, while more than 200 first responders combed thousands of acres of woodland in 100-degree heat, while a local restaurant owner cooked and delivered 60 free meals to keep exhausted search crews fed, while digital billboards flashed a missing child's photo to every passing car on Oscaga Lake Road, according to investigators, there was no missing child to find, alive or otherwise, anywhere within that search radius. There was only a story, allegedly constructed and maintained by 2 parents, that sent an entire county searching for a girl who had already been gone for weeks. The next day, Sunday, July 5th, both parents appeared separately before Magistrate Judge Ronald Thornton for bond hearings. Neither had legal representation present. Michelle Herring's hearing came first, around 10:30 that morning. Because of the additional false police report charge stacked on top of the homicide charge, Thornton ruled she would be held without bond. In the course of the hearing, small, almost mundane logistical details emerged, the kind of paperwork that feels jarring set against the scale of what she was accused of. She told the judge she worked for a company and was paid bi-weekly, roughly $1,300 per paycheck. Thornton determined her income was too high to qualify for a court-appointed public defender. When asked who else lived in her household, she answered simply, the father, adding that he also worked. Javeayah Harris's hearing followed that same afternoon, around 1:30. He too was denied bond. He eventually told the court where he worked, though he said he wasn't sure exactly how much he brought home on a weekly basis. When Thornton asked whether there were others in his household, Harris answered, "My girlfriend," and then, in a noticeably softer tone, added, "My child." That single word choice, "my child," delivered quietly, almost as an afterthought, in a courtroom where he was being arraigned for that same child's homicide, is the kind of detail a courtroom sketch artist could spend an entire career trying to capture, and never quite manage. Neither Harris nor Herring showed visible emotion during their respective hearings, according to those present, a detail local reporters noted without much elaboration, though it's the kind of thing true crime audiences often fixate on, rightly or wrongly, as some kind of window into guilt or innocence. It's worth resisting that particular temptation here. Demeanor in a courtroom, especially in the disorienting first days after an arrest, tells you very little on its own about what someone did or didn't do. People process shock differently. Some collapse, some go flat and silent. Neither reaction proves anything in either direction, and it's not the basis on which this case, or any case, should ultimately be judged. Because homicide charges fall outside a magistrate judge's authority in South Carolina, both cases would need to move to circuit court for any future bond determination. For the time being, both parents would remain in custody, held without bond, awaiting a legal process that had only just begun. And there was one more detail from that Sunday that's easy to lose amid the horror of everything else, but shouldn't be: a newborn. Javeayah Harris had given birth just days earlier, the same baby she'd been 39 weeks pregnant with during that original 911 call. That infant, authorities confirmed, had already been placed in the custody of a family member by the time these hearings took place. Javeayah's baby sibling would never spend a single night in the home their parents were arrested from, would, in fact, likely never have any real memory of either parent outside of a jail visitation room or a courtroom gallery. By the time the public had absorbed all of this, the arrests, the denied bonds, the newborn already placed with relatives, the case had transformed almost overnight from a missing persons search into something the community was still struggling to fully process. And the worst of it, as it turned out, hadn't even been made public yet. Take a moment to drop a thought on what you think so far in this case. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Monday, July 6th, 2026. Arrest warrants are unsealed, and alongside them, the sheriff's office makes the unusual decision to release the full 911 call to the public. The warrants describe both parents as having shown, in the exact language of the court documents, extreme indifference to human life. According to those same warrants, Javeayah suffered a head injury as the result of physical abuse. Abuse the warrants attribute specifically to her mother. Neither parent, the warrants allege, ever sought medical attention for that injury. Instead, according to investigators, the injury was simply left untreated, and at some point within the window investigators identified, between May 1st and June 8th, Javeayah Harris died. Both parents, according to reporting on the contents of those warrants, confessed. Reading the transcript of that original 911 call, now knowing what investigators allege actually happened, turns an ordinary emergency dispatch recording into something genuinely difficult to sit through. Herring's voice, calm enough to spell out her daughter's unusual name letter by letter. Her insistence that Javeayah can carry a full conversation, that she's very smart. Her explanation that she was 39 weeks pregnant and physically limited in how quickly she could search the yard herself. Every detail in that call reads, in hindsight, like it was constructed, whether deliberately or out of some deeper denial, to sound exactly like the worst-case scenario every parent secretly fears: a fast, curious child who simply wandered a few steps too far. If the warrants are accurate, none of it was true in the way it was presented. Javeayah wasn't playing in the backyard that night. She wasn't wearing those Minnie Mouse pajamas because she'd just been put to bed. According to the timeline investigators laid out in the warrants, she had already been gone, in every sense, for weeks before that phone ever rang. This is usually the moment in a true crime case where the story hinges on some external break: a witness coming forward, new forensic technology, an anonymous tip. Here, the break came from inside the crime itself. The confessions, once secured, accelerated the entire investigation almost immediately. Search boats from SLED and the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources launched that same Monday morning into an area investigators referred to only as an area of interest: Debutary Creek, near the Great Falls area, close to where Chester and Fairfield counties meet, more than an hour's drive north of the family's Aiken home. Officials wouldn't say publicly, at least not yet, exactly what evidence had led them to that specific stretch of water, but the equipment told its own story, before a single official word confirmed anything. You don't need search boats and marine units to find a 4-year-old who wandered off into her own backyard. Boats mean water. Water, at this stage of an investigation, means investigators believe a body is somewhere beneath its surface. And the sheer distance between that search site and Javeayah's home, more than 60 miles, told anyone paying close attention that whatever had happened to her, it had happened far from where the public had been looking all along. On Tuesday, July 7th, investigators returned to the family's Hillsborough Street home, this time accompanied by staff from the Aiken County Coroner's Office, a detail that, on its own, signaled how far the investigation had shifted. Crime scene tape went up around the property. Deputies searched the wooded area directly behind the house for hours, working methodically before finally leaving the scene around 9 p.m. A law enforcement source told local reporters that the crews at that particular location weren't searching for a body, they were searching for evidence. Whatever had happened to Javeayah, investigators apparently believed some physical trace of it was still sitting inside or around that home, waiting to be documented. Meanwhile, the search effort in Fairfield County stretched into its own grim, waterlogged marathon. The area known locally as Stumpy Pond, named for the dead trees and half-submerged stumps that choke its shallow water, made for brutal, painstaking search conditions. Good for fishing, by local accounts, but nearly impossible to navigate methodically, especially for crews trying to search foot by foot, boat by boat, for something as small and fragile as a child's remains. The South Carolina Department of Natural Resources led the water search, joined by the Fairfield County Sheriff's Office and local volunteer firefighters. A steady line of vehicles came and went along the single narrow access road leading into the site. No one was permitted down that road who wasn't law enforcement. Multiple unmarked vehicles arrived over the following days. Sled's presence at the site only grew. At some point during that stretch of searching, members of Javeayah's extended family arrived at the Fairfield County site themselves, in tears, according to reporters who witnessed it, looking for whatever scraps of information they could get from investigators willing to speak with them. It's a detail that cuts through all the procedural language of warrants and search grids. Real people, related by blood to a little girl they loved, standing at the edge of a reservoir named for its stumps, waiting for someone to tell them something, anything, about what had happened to her. By this point in the investigation, the case had also expanded in an entirely different direction, backward, into the family's own history. Reporters working the story discovered that both Harris and Herring had prior ties to Union County, more than an hour's drive northwest of Aiken. Court records showed Herring had been named in an eviction case filed by the Union Housing Authority back in December of 2025. That case concluded in January 2026 with a writ of ejection, ruled in the landlord's favor. Separately, court records showed Harris had been named in his own eviction case back in 2023, filed by a private rental management company, which was ultimately settled that November. And then came a detail that recontextualized the entire relationship. In 2025, police in Clinton, South Carolina, another Union County community, had been called out to the couple's apartment for a domestic disturbance. According to the incident report, officers responded to a verbal argument between Harris and Herring after Harris began gathering his belongings to leave the residence. Herring told the responding officers there was an active restraining order in place, and that Harris, along with his mother and sister specifically, were not supposed to be near her at all. Harris, for his part, gave a different account, that the two had actually been arguing since the previous day, that the specific dispute that afternoon had started over something as small as moving a table inside the apartment, and that he'd already arranged for a friend to come pick him up before Herring ever called the police. The report noted no visible injuries on either party and classified the entire incident as non-criminal. Eventually, according to the report, tensions cooled enough that Herring herself offered to drive Harris to wherever he needed to go, an offer he declined, choosing instead to wait for his friend's arrival. It's a small, almost mundane domestic dispute, the kind of call police departments across the country field constantly, and one that, viewed in total isolation, tells you very little. Most couples who argue over furniture and restraining orders never go on to face homicide charges. But laid next to everything that followed, the eviction filings, the housing instability, the quiet neighbors who barely noticed the family, and eventually the warrants describing extreme indifference to human life, it becomes one more data point in a pattern, a relationship marked by repeated instability, by at least one documented police intervention, by conflict serious enough to involve a restraining order, all of it unfolding around a small child who had absolutely no say in any of it, and no system in place checking in closely enough to notice how much danger she might have actually been in. It's worth being honest about what that pattern does and doesn't tell us, because true crime storytelling has a bad habit of reverse engineering a tidy narrative once the worst outcome is already known. In hindsight, every eviction notice, every police report, every quiet neighbor's comment starts to feel like a missed warning sign, as if, laid end to end, they should have added up to something obvious. But that's the benefit of hindsight talking, not the reality of how these situations actually look from the inside while they're happening. A restraining order between two young parents navigating a volatile relationship doesn't, on its own, predict child homicide. An eviction filing doesn't either. Financial precarity is, unfortunately, an extremely common condition for young families across this country, and the overwhelming majority of families living through housing instability and relationship conflict never come anywhere close to harming a child. What this pattern does tell us, and what advocates like Peggy Ford and Aaron Milam have been careful to emphasize since this case broke, is something more structural than any individual red flag. It tells us that the systems meant to catch families in crisis largely rely on someone noticing, someone reporting, someone with eyes inside that household connecting enough dots to intervene. And in a case like this one, where the family moved between counties, where neighbors described them as quiet and largely invisible, where there's no indication any formal child welfare investigation was ever opened prior to Javeayah's death, those systems simply never got the chance to activate. Whether they would have made any difference even if they had, is a question no one can answer with certainty. But it's the exact question child advocacy organizations across South Carolina have been asking louder since July 9th. Not how could two parents do this, which is in some ways an unanswerable question about human cruelty, but what would it take for a family like this one to be seen by someone, anyone, before a tragedy like this becomes possible? Thursday, July 9th, 2026. Sheriff Marty Sawyer stands at a podium for the update the entire state had been dreading since the arrests 5 days earlier. Investigators, he announces, have recovered some of Javeayah Harris's remains, found in Cedar Creek Reservoir, the body of water locals call Stumpy Pond in Fairfield County. DNA testing conducted through SLED's forensic lab confirmed what everyone following the case had already feared. The remains were consistent with the biological child of Javeayah Harris and Michelle Herring. Javeayah Harris was dead. Confirmed, finally, in the cruelest and most clinical way a family can receive that kind of news. Not through a body brought home, not through a funeral home director, but through a DNA match announced at a press conference. But Sawyer wasn't finished, and what he described next stands as one of the most disturbing forensic details ever attached to a South Carolina homicide case in recent memory. Based on forensic evidence, statements gathered during the investigation, and detailed analysis, Sawyer said, extensive and deliberate efforts had been made to destroy and conceal evidence of Javeayah's death. Corrosive chemicals, he said, along with other unspecified tools were used, according to the investigation, to accelerate the destruction of her body. And whatever ultimately remained after that process, according to the warrants, was transported to Cedar Creek Reservoir and disposed of in the water itself. Because of the extent of that destruction, Sawyer told reporters bluntly, it's unlikely Javeayah's full remains will ever be recovered. Not with more searching, not with more time, not with any forensic technology currently available to investigators. Sit with that for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing mention. A 4-year-old girl, the same girl her father once called friendly, the same girl her mother once described on a 911 call as able to carry a full conversation, reduced, according to investigators, to whatever fragments corrosive chemicals happened to leave behind. A search effort that had once involved a helicopter, drones, cadaver dogs, and 200 first responders combing the woods for a living child had, by July 9th, become something else entirely. A search for whatever chemicals and time had not already erased. Sawyer, a sheriff with nearly 4 decades of law enforcement service behind him, didn't try to hide how deeply this particular case had affected him personally. There are some very harsh words I would like to use about Javeayah and Michelle and their actions, he said from the podium, before catching himself. But I will not do that. In order to protect and maintain the integrity of this case. He paused, then added the line that would end up defining public perception of this case more than almost any other. But I will tell you this. I will not refer to them as mom and dad, or mother or father. They don't deserve that title. It's an extraordinary thing for a career law enforcement officer to say publicly, on the record, in the middle of a still active case where both individuals remain legally presumed innocent. And it tells you everything about how deeply this particular discovery landed inside a department that had just spent a week and a half searching, in dangerous heat, for a little girl whose death, allegedly, had already been concealed inside her own home for a month, before anyone outside that household ever knew to start looking. It's worth understanding, briefly, what actually goes into a confirmation like that one, because DNA testing confirmed the remains is a sentence that gets said quickly in a press conference, but represents days of exacting forensic work behind the scenes. When remains are recovered from water, especially water as murky and stump-choked as Cedar Creek Reservoir, investigators first have to determine whether what's been recovered is even biological material versus organic debris pulled up from the reservoir bed. From there, forensic analysts typically work to extract viable DNA, a task made significantly harder by water exposure, by time, and in this case, by whatever chemical degradation had already occurred before the remains ever reached the reservoir at all. That sample then gets compared against reference DNA, typically pulled from the parents themselves or from other close biological relatives, to establish a match with the degree of statistical certainty required to stand up in a criminal proceeding. SLED's forensic laboratory handled that analysis in this case, and their confirmation is what allowed Sawyer to stand at that podium on July 9th and say, definitively, that the remains recovered from Stumpy Pond were consistent with Javeayah Harris. It's a process that usually takes place entirely out of public view, in a lab, far removed from the emotional weight of a candlelight vigil or a grieving family standing at a reservoir's edge. But it's worth naming because it's the quiet, methodical, unglamorous forensic science that ultimately gave this case something a chemical disposal was specifically intended to prevent: a confirmed identity, and the beginning of an answer for a family that otherwise might never have gotten one at all. It's rare for a sitting sheriff to say, on camera, that he refuses to use the words mom and dad for two people who biologically are exactly that. It's rarer still for that kind of statement to draw as little public pushback as Sawyer's did. No op-eds accusing him of prejudging a case still headed to trial. No defense attorneys publicly objecting to a lead investigator editorializing about his own department's suspects. If anything, the statement seemed to crystallize something the entire community was already feeling, but hadn't quite had the language for. Sawyer wasn't speaking as a neutral arbiter of facts in that moment. He was speaking as a person who had just spent a week and a half of his professional life and the professional lives of 200 people under his command, in service of a search that never had any chance of succeeding, for reasons only two people in the world had known the entire time. That kind of institutional betrayal, the sense that an entire department's resources, urgency, and goodwill were spent chasing a story investigators now allege was fabricated, tends to leave a mark that outlasts any single press conference. Departments that live through cases like this often point back to them years later as the case that changed how they screen initial reports, how quickly they escalate certain kinds of missing child calls, how much weight they give to a parent's demeanor versus the physical plausibility of a story. Whether the Aiken County Sheriff's Office undergoes that kind of internal reckoning in the coming months remains to be seen. But Sawyer's words at that podium, measured, restrained, and then suddenly not, suggest a department still actively working through exactly how something like this could have unfolded so completely under its nose. With Javeayah's death now officially confirmed, prosecutors moved quickly to add new charges against both parents: destruction and desecration of human remains, layered directly on top of the existing homicide by child abuse charges each of them already faced. In South Carolina, homicide by child abuse alone carries a sentence ranging from 20 years to life in prison upon conviction. Herring's additional charge of filing a false police report carries a separate potential penalty of up to 5 years in prison, or a fine of up to $5,000, entirely apart from the homicide case. Neither parent has gone to trial. Both remain in custody as of this recording, denied bond, awaiting the next stages of a legal process that is still very much unfolding. Herring's first formal court appearance has been scheduled for September 18th. SLED continues assisting Aiken County investigators as the case moves toward eventual indictment, and search efforts around Cedar Creek Reservoir continue in the event any additional remains can still be recovered. It's tempting, in a case built around a detail as horrifying as chemical destruction of remains, to let that single image overwrite everything else about the people involved. But responsible true crime storytelling asks a harder, more uncomfortable question than what happened at the end. It asks, how does something like this happen in the first place, and who around it might have had a chance to see the cracks before they became unrepairable? What we actually know about Javeayah Harris and Javeayah Herring paints a picture of a young couple, 23 and 22 years old at the time of their arrests, moving frequently between residences, facing real and repeated housing instability, and, at least once on official record, involved in a domestic dispute serious enough to bring police to their apartment door. 2 separate eviction filings, years apart in 2 different counties, a restraining order referenced explicitly in a 2025 police report, a relationship that neighbors at a prior residence described, almost unanimously, as one they barely noticed at all, a household that kept entirely to itself. None of that, on its own, predicts what investigators now allege happened to Javeayah. Millions of young couples across the country face eviction, financial strain, and relationship conflict without ever coming close to harming their children. But it does sketch the outline of a household under sustained, largely invisible strain, a family that never appeared on the radar of the systems specifically designed to catch struggling households before a genuine crisis point. And that invisibility is exactly the tension child welfare advocates in Aiken have pointed to, repeatedly and publicly, since this case first broke. Peggy Ford, Executive Director of Children's Place Inc. in Aiken, spoke at length in the days following confirmation of Javeayah's death, reflecting on precisely this dynamic. "We all wish we could find every family that's struggling before tragedy strikes," she said. "It's much more common than what we want to believe." She spoke candidly about how difficult it can be to recognize abuse from the outside, describing it as something people find hard to both fathom that it happens and to see it when you're not part of the everyday life of a child, and stressed that real prevention has to start earlier than any crisis response, with families themselves recognizing they need help and genuinely believing that kind of help is something they're allowed to ask for. Erin Milam, Executive Director of the Child Advocacy Center of Aiken County, echoed the same underlying plea in simpler, more direct terms. "Every child," she said, "deserves to grow up in a safe and nurturing environment." It's the kind of statement that sounds almost too obvious to need saying out loud, until you remember exactly why it needed to be said in that particular moment, in direct response to a 4-year-old whose death had to be confirmed through a DNA match, rather than a body brought home. There's a detail worth sitting with here that's easy to skip past. Javeayah Harris was 23 years old at the time of his arrest. Mitchell A. Herring was 22. They were, by any reasonable measure, still extremely young themselves. Young enough that in a different set of circumstances, they'd still be considered barely out of the earliest years of adulthood. Two young parents, a 4-year-old, a newborn on the way, working jobs at a logistics company and a customer service provider, moving between rental properties, at least once facing eviction, at least once involved in a domestic dispute serious enough to draw police attention. None of that context excuses what investigators allege happened, but it does complicate the instinct to render defendants as simple monsters rather than people whose documented history suggests a household under real, sustained pressure long before anything resembling the events described in the warrants. It's a genuinely difficult needle to thread in a case like this, acknowledging the human context of two young, financially strained parents without ever slipping into excusing what they're accused of doing, or suggesting struggle somehow explains away a 4-year-old's death. Those two things can both be true. A young couple can be facing real financial and relational strain, and also be responsible, according to the state's own allegations, for one of the most disturbing homicide cases their county has ever prosecuted. Holding both of those truths at once is uncomfortable. It's also, if we're being honest about what actually produces cases like this one, closer to the reality than any simpler story we might prefer to tell ourselves. The family member most directly, permanently affected by all of this, in the most literal sense, is the newborn, Javeayah's baby sibling, born just days before both parents were arrested, now growing up in the custody of a paternal grandmother, according to a family friend who spoke with reporters. That baby will very likely never carry a single memory of the sister they never really got the chance to meet. Their entire understanding of their own family's story will eventually be pieced together secondhand, from news articles, from court records, from whatever a grandmother chooses, someday, to explain, rather than from any lived memory of their own. And then there's Javeayah's extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, who authorities say have asked the public, through the sheriff's office, for exactly one thing: privacy. "We have spoken to Javeayah's extended family," Sawyer said during his July 4th announcement of the arrests, "and we ask for you to respect their privacy. We can only imagine what they are going through." It's worth remembering, amid all the procedural detail of arrest warrants and reservoir searches and forensic chemistry, that somewhere in and around Aiken County, real people are grieving a real child. People who watched search parties comb the woods for her, who likely held her, fed her, celebrated birthdays with her, now left to process a loss made unimaginably worse by exactly how it came to be understood. On July 9th, 2026, the same day Sheriff Sawyer stood at a podium and confirmed Javeayah's death, describing in graphic terms the chemical destruction of her remains. Hundreds of people gathered at an event center on Shiloh Heights Road for a candlelight vigil. They brought exactly what you'd expect people to bring in memory of a 4-year-old girl: balloons drifting overhead in the summer evening air, stuffed Minnie Mouse toys, a quiet aching echo of the pajamas she was last known to have been wearing, flowers laid in careful rows, candles that lit up the faces of people who, in the overwhelming majority of cases, had never once met the little girl they were now mourning together. Pastor Joshua Stallings of Remnant Ministries delivered a message to the gathered crowd that evening, the specific, particular language of communal grief that small southern towns have refined over generations: shared prayer, shared silence, the peculiar ache of mourning a child none of you personally knew, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who somehow all understood exactly why you were there. All of it played out under a sky lit by candlelight, just miles from the reservoir where DNA testing had confirmed her remains only hours earlier that same day. People who attended that vigil described a crowd that skewed heavily toward people who had never met Javeayah, her parents, or anyone in her extended family. Neighbors from entirely different parts of Aiken County. Parents who'd simply seen the story on local news and felt compelled to show up. Teenagers holding candles alongside grandparents. It's a specific kind of collective grief that true crime stories don't always capture well in writing, because so much of it lives in things that don't translate easily to a script. The particular quiet of 200 people standing together saying nothing at all, the way candlelight moves against faces in a parking lot at dusk, the sound of a pastor's voice carrying just far enough to reach the back row and no further. What can be said plainly is that an entire community chose, deliberately, to show up in person for a child none of them had known, not because it would change anything about the outcome, but because showing up was the only thing left within their power to do. By the time reporters checked back in roughly a week after Javeayah was first reported missing, what had begun as a single organized vigil had grown into something local coverage described plainly as a movement, a spreading, informal collection of tributes, stuffed animals, handwritten signs, and grassroots child welfare advocacy that stretched well beyond that first candlelit gathering. The family's Hillsborough Street home, once wrapped in crime scene tape, slowly became the site of a continuously growing memorial. One teddy bear, left quietly at the edge of the property in the first days of the search, multiplied into dozens. Out of that collective grief came something more permanent. A petition began circulating in the case's aftermath, calling on state lawmakers to pass what advocates have started calling Javeayah's Law, proposed legislation aimed at closing what petition organizers describe as a federal loophole in child protection reporting requirements. Whether that specific push ultimately gains real legislative traction remains genuinely uncertain at this stage, but it's a familiar and recurring pattern in American true crime coverage. A child's death becoming the namesake attached to a proposed law meant, in theory, to prevent the next one from happening the same way. Local news coverage in the weeks following Javeayah's death also turned toward a broader, more uncomfortable public conversation. Child abuse cases, according to advocates speaking to reporters, are reportedly on the rise across South Carolina, and Javeayah's case has become something of a rallying point for reminding the public that recognizing warning signs, unexplained isolation, unexplained injuries, sudden and unexplained changes in a child's behavior, is a responsibility that belongs to an entire community, not solely to social workers and law enforcement responding after tragedy has already occurred. Advocacy organizations across the state have used the renewed attention to push a consistent, simple message. Reporting a concern doesn't require certainty. Neighbors, family friends, co-workers, and extended family members are often the first to notice small, easy-to-dismiss signs. A child who suddenly stops coming outside to play, injuries explained away with the same vague story every time, a household that grows quieter and more closed off over a matter of months. None of those signs, on their own, prove abuse is happening. But advocates emphasize that the threshold for making a report to Child Protective Services isn't proof, it's reasonable concern, and that erring on the side of raising a concern that turns out to be nothing is always preferable to staying silent out of fear of overreacting. It's a message aimed less at professionals who already know the reporting protocols, and more at ordinary neighbors, the kind of people who, in this specific case, later admitted they'd barely noticed the family at all. It's worth noting, too, just how much of this entire case unfolded in full public view, in real time, rather than being pieced together years later, the way so many true crime stories are. Digital billboards, live-streamed press conferences, a released 911 call, real-time reporting from multiple local news outlets tracking search boats moving into Fairfield County waters within hours of a confession being confirmed. In an era where true crime storytelling so often looks backward, decades-old cold cases finally cracked by genetic genealogy, forensic breakthroughs revisiting evidence gathered before some of us were even born, the Javeayah Harris case is something rarer and, in some ways, harder to sit with. A tragedy that unfolded almost entirely in the present tense, with a community responding to each new detail as it broke, rather than processing it all at once with the benefit of hindsight. That real-time quality changed the way this story moved through the community, too. Unlike a cold case where the emotional arc has decades to settle, where the shock has already been absorbed, processed, and turned into something closer to historical memory, Aiken County lived through this one in real time, with no idea, day to day, what the next headline would bring. People who'd donated to the search fund, who'd shared Javeayah's photo on social media, who'd driven past those digital billboards on Oscaga Lake Road every day on their commute, woke up on July 4th to learn the people they'd been rooting for as grieving parents were, according to investigators, the ones responsible all along. That's a specific, compounding kind of grief. Not just mourning a child's death, but having to simultaneously reprocess an entire week of misdirected sympathy, of having genuinely believed a story that turned out, according to authorities, to be a fabrication built on top of an actual tragedy. It's not hard to understand, then, why the community's response afterward was so visible, so insistent on showing up in person rather than just posting online. The candlelight vigil, the growing memorial outside the Hillsborough Street home, the push for Javeayah's law, all of it reads in part as a community trying to reclaim some sense of agency after finding out that its own goodwill had, in effect, been used against it for the better part of a week. As of this recording, both Javeayah Harris and Michelle Herring remain in custody in Aiken County, denied bond, facing charges of homicide by child abuse. Herring additionally faces charges of filing a false police report and, alongside Harris, destruction and desecration of human remains. Neither has gone to trial. Under South Carolina law, and under the basic principles that underpin the American legal system generally, both are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, regardless of the confessions described within the arrest warrants or the statements made publicly by investigators throughout this case. That presumption matters, and it's worth stating plainly. Everything described in this video regarding the parents' alleged actions comes from warrants, sheriff's statements, and court proceedings, not from a verdict, because no verdict yet exists. Herring's first scheduled court appearance is set for September 18th. If convicted, both parents face a sentence of 20 years to life in prison on the homicide charge alone, with additional time potentially added for the desecration and false report charges. For viewers less familiar with how a case like this actually moves through the system, it's worth walking through what likely comes next. Because the underlying charge is homicide, this case bypasses the county's magistrate court almost entirely and proceeds instead through circuit court, South Carolina's Court of General Jurisdiction for serious felony matters. Before any trial can happen, prosecutors typically need to secure a formal indictment from a grand jury, a step that allows the state to present its evidence, the warrants, the confessions, the forensic findings from Cedar Creek Reservoir, to a panel of citizens who determine whether there's sufficient cause to proceed to trial. Given the volume of forensic evidence still being processed, and the sheer geographic spread of this investigation across Aiken, Fairfield, and Union counties, legal analysts who've spoken to local reporters suggest this case could take many months, if not longer, to reach an actual trial date. Both Harris and Herring will also have the opportunity, at various points along the way, to request bond reconsideration before a circuit court judge, something a magistrate simply doesn't have the authority to grant for a homicide charge. Whether either of them will be granted bond at that stage, given the severity of the charges, the existence of alleged confessions, and the destruction of evidence charges layered on top, remains to be seen. It's also entirely possible, as happens in a significant number of homicide cases nationally, that this case could ultimately resolve through a plea agreement rather than a full jury trial, particularly if the confessions described in the warrants hold up as prosecutors continue building their case. For now, though, both parents are exercising their right to have these allegations proven, formally, in a court of law, and nothing about the eventual outcome is decided yet. It's also worth noting that cases involving multiple jurisdictions, as this one does, spanning Aiken, Fairfield, and Union counties, sometimes involve coordination between different solicitors' offices and law enforcement agencies to determine exactly where charges will ultimately be prosecuted and how evidence gathered across county lines will be consolidated. That kind of jurisdictional coordination adds its own layer of complexity and time to an already lengthy pretrial process. Viewers hoping for a quick resolution to this case should expect, realistically, a slow and methodical legal process, one that will likely generate its own set of headlines and updates over the coming months. Long after the initial shock of these July revelations has faded from the news cycle, search efforts around Cedar Creek Reservoir in Fairfield County continue as of this recording, though Sheriff Sawyer has been candid with the public that the extent of the alleged chemical destruction makes full recovery of Javeayah's remains genuinely unlikely. SLED continues assisting Aiken County investigators as the case moves through its pretrial phase, and legal experts who've spoken with local reporters describe a case still very much in motion, prosecutors working toward formal indictment, investigators continuing to process forensic evidence recovered from both the Hillsborough Street property and the reservoir itself, with major strategic decisions still ahead regarding exactly how this case will ultimately be tried. What we know for certain, beyond any of the legal uncertainty still to come, is this: a 4-year-old girl who loved the color pink, who talked easily and warmly with total strangers, who liked to play near a chicken coop in her own backyard, is gone. Her death was concealed, according to investigators. for a full month before anyone outside her immediate household ever knew there was reason to look for her. And when the search finally did come, the helicopters, the drones, the 200 first responders, the free meals delivered by a stranger who simply wanted to help, the digital billboards flashing her photo to every passing car. According to authorities, it was already far too late to matter. Sheriff Sawyer said it best. In the same July 9th press conference where his voice first cracked on camera, these updates never get easier to share. This past week has been heart-wrenching for everyone. There's a version of this story that ends simply with the arrests, or with the DNA confirmation, or with a sentencing hearing years from now. A version that treats the legal resolution as the actual ending. But anyone who's spent real time covering cases like this one knows that's not quite how it works. The legal process will run its course, on its own timeline, largely disconnected from anything the rest of us can do about it. What actually continues, long after headlines move on to the next tragedy, is everything that surrounds a case like this. A newborn who will grow up needing an honest answer, eventually, to a question no child should ever have to ask. A sheriff's department that spent 5 days searching in dangerous heat and will likely carry that particular case in its institutional memory for years. A community that organized itself around compassion for a stranger's child, only to learn, in the cruelest possible way, exactly how that compassion had been used. None of that resolves cleanly on September 18th, or whenever a jury eventually reaches a verdict. It just continues, quietly, the way real grief always does, long after the cameras have gone home. Somewhere in Aiken County tonight, there's a nursery that was never used the way it was supposed to be. There's a newborn growing up with a grandmother, instead of the two parents who were supposed to raise them. And there's a memorial outside a house on Hillsborough Street that keeps quietly growing. One stuffed Minnie Mouse toy, one candle, one flower at a time. Because sometimes, while a justice system slowly works its way toward whatever answers it can ultimately provide, the only thing left for the rest of us to do is show up, say a name out loud, and make sure it isn't forgotten. Javeayah Harris was 4 years old. Rest in peace.